My name is Hilda, I am 60 years old, and what I am about to share will change how you look at family forever. Only a few days ago, my own son Damien and his wife Melissa did something I never believed my children could do. They tried to get rid of my husband Henry and me during a trip, leaving us badly hurt and helpless. As I lay there in pain, I heard Henry quietly tell me to stay still and pretend nothing was wrong, but that moment was not even the hardest part. The real shock came when he finally told me a painful truth, a secret our children had hidden for 25 long years, something no mother is ever ready to hear. For nearly 40 years, Henry and I believed we had built a happy, simple life together in our small suburban home, where mornings began with the smell of coffee and the sound of birds. I worked as a schoolteacher and loved coming home to share stories about my students, while Henry spent his days in his carpentry shop, turning plain wood into beautiful furniture with his skilled hands. We had two sons, Richard, our eldest, and Damien, who was 5 years younger, and although Richard was cheerful, helpful, and full of warmth, and Damien was quieter and more distant, I loved them both equally, or at least I believed I did. Every Sunday after church, we sat together at the oak table Henry had made himself, listening to Richard talk about his dreams of becoming an engineer while Damien mostly stayed quiet, pushing food around his plate. Our life felt peaceful and full, and in the evenings Henry and I would walk around town, talking about growing old together and one day watching our grandchildren grow, never once thinking those walks would prepare me for the hardest day of my life. On weekends, I often hosted family gatherings with my sisters Harriet and Irene visiting with their families, and back then I truly believed we were living inside a story that could never break. Our house used to be full of noise and joy, with children running around, the women talking and cooking together in the kitchen, and the men busy fixing things outside. Henry was the kind of husband many people only dream of, and even after 40 years of marriage he still surprised me with small wildflowers he picked on his way to work. He helped me check my students' papers and I helped him in his workshop by holding the wood while he worked, and we truly felt like a strong team that nothing could break. In the evenings we would sit on the porch, look at the stars and talk about our plans, like traveling after retirement, seeing the ocean for the first time, and building a smaller home once our children had families of their own. Looking back, I now understand that what seems like perfect happiness can sometimes hide very painful truths. When Richard turned 20, something in our family began to feel different, and he started arguing with Damien about things I couldn't make sense of. I often heard them talking quietly in the hallway and they would stop the moment I showed up, but Henry told me it was just normal brother problems and that it would pass, and I chose to believe him because I wanted to believe our family was still fine. Then one night in October 25 years ago, Richard didn't come home for dinner, and we waited hour after hour while Damien stayed in his room, claiming to study, though there was something in his eyes that made me uneasy whenever I asked about his brother. Henry and some neighbors went out to look for Richard, searching the whole town, the nearby paths, and all the places he liked to go, and at sunrise they found him at the bottom of the river gorge. The police said it was a terrible accident and that he must have fallen in the dark, and I accepted that because I couldn't face the idea that something worse could be true. Richard's funeral was the hardest day of my life, and I wore the same black dress I had worn when my own mother died, while Damien stood there strangely calm for someone who had just lost his brother, quiet and distant in a way that now, knowing what I know, still makes me feel cold inside. I cried until I had no strength left, and Henry stayed beside me the whole time, holding me and whispering words meant to comfort me, even though I now realize those words must have been heavy on his heart. After Richard's death, Damien was never the same again, and our family slowly became something very different from what I thought it was. After Richard was gone, Damien suddenly became more caring and thoughtful, almost as if he were trying to make up for something. He helped me around the house, spent more time with his father in the workshop, and always tried to cheer me up when he saw I was feeling low. I believe this was simply his way of dealing with the loss and trying to fill the empty space his brother had left behind, and I never once questioned it. Looking back now, I see how innocent the first was, because what he was really doing was creating a perfect image, a kind and loving face that hid what was truly inside him. The years went by, and although the pain never fully disappeared, we learned to live with it and move forward. Damien married Melissa, a nice young woman from the nearby town, and they looked happy together, and when they had two lovely children, I honestly felt like life was giving us another chance to be a family again. Melissa called me mom and helped me around the house during their visits, and Damien followed in his father's footsteps by becoming a skilled carpenter and starting his own business, and for a while, everything felt peaceful again. But now, as I lay hurt and helpless at the bottom of that deep gorge, I finally understand that all of that happiness was carefully built on a lie. The first time I felt something wasn't right was about 6 months ago, when Henry and I decided it was time to update our will. We had worked and saved our whole lives, and between our house, the land I inherited from my parents, and our savings, we had close to $200,000 to leave to our family. It was Damien who suggested we go see a lawyer, telling us gently that since we were both 60, it was important to have everything arranged properly, and Melissa stood beside him, holding my hand and saying how much they loved us and wanted to make sure we were taken care of. At the time, I took those words as proof of their love without realizing how wrong I was. Our lawyer, an older man named Albert whom we had known for years, explained all the choices we had, like setting up a trust, dividing things between the grandchildren, or writing a simple will. Damien strongly pushed for putting everything in his and Melissa's names, saying they would fairly manage things for the children and that we would need their help more and more as we got older, so it would be easier if they had control of the money. Something about the way he said it made me uneasy, but Henry, who had always been more trusting than I was, agreed to it without much argument, and I let myself believe everything would be fine. I still had my doubts, especially because I remembered how Richard had always talked about supporting us when we got older, and he had real plans and hopes to take care of us one day. But Richard was gone, and Damien was now our only living child, so in the end, we went along with it and signed the papers on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. I remember Melissa was wearing a lovely green dress, and after everything was finished she hugged me tightly and whispered that we were now one family forever. And for some reason her words made me feel uneasy even though I couldn't explain why. Damien shook his father's hand with a smile that looked polite but felt empty, and that evening while I was making dinner, I couldn't get rid of the feeling that we had just made a very serious mistake. In the weeks that followed, Damien and Melissa started coming over much more often, but their visits no longer felt warm or natural, because they always had ideas about what we should change, what we should invest in, or what kind of insurance we should buy. Melissa even suggested that we sell our big house and move into a smaller place in town, saying she would help us find something suitable, but that house was my whole life, filled with memories in every room, from the kitchen where I had cooked for decades to the workshop where Henry had done his best work, and the yard where our children and grandchildren had played. When I told them I didn't want to leave, I saw a flash of annoyance in Damien's eyes that scared me. He spoke to me in a cold, unfamiliar way, saying the house was too big for people our age and that if something happened, they wouldn't be able to help us in time, and Melissa agreed, adding that it cost too much to keep and that it would be smarter to sell while prices were good. Henry slowly started to listen to them, as he had always been a practical man, and he began to talk about their ideas as if they made sense. Still, deep inside I felt there was another reason behind all this pressure. One night, after another uncomfortable talk, I asked Henry if he didn't find it strange that Damien was suddenly so interested in our money and property, and he told me that our son was only trying to take care of us and that maybe we should think about it since we weren't young anymore. But I noticed a doubt in his eyes that he didn't want to admit, and now I understand that Henry had already started to suspect something and was quietly putting pieces together that I couldn't yet see. Things became even more worrying when Damien suggested that we give him full control over our finances, saying it was only a safety measure in case one of us ever got sick or couldn't handle things ourselves. He explained it so calmly, while Melissa made tea in our kitchen as if she already belonged there, that for a moment it almost sounded reasonable, but something about how strongly he pushed the idea made me feel deeply uneasy. That night I couldn't sleep at all and just lay there staring at the ceiling, listening to Henry breathe and trying to understand why my heart felt so heavy with fear. The next morning I called my sister Harriet, who had always been wiser and more careful about people's true intentions, and when I told her everything she went quiet before finally asking me why Damien, who was already doing well with his own business, would be so eager to take control of our money. Her words opened my eyes, because she was right. He had never needed our help before and had never shown any sign of money trouble. Later that day, when Damien came again to talk about our future plans, I decided to ask him directly why he was so determined to manage our affairs when Henry and I were still perfectly capable. His face changed at once, and for a brief moment I saw a cold and unsettling look in his eyes that reminded me of something I couldn't quite place, and he answered in a tight voice that it wasn't about control, but about love and responsibility, though the way he said it felt more like a warning than care. Melissa quickly stepped in with her gentle tone, saying they only wanted what was best for us. But that evening after they left, Henry and I had our first real argument in many years, because he thought I was just being fearful for no reason, while I was certain something about our son was no longer right. As we stood in the kitchen washing dishes, I asked Henry if he remembered how different Damien had been before Richard died, quieter and more distant in a way that had always made me uncomfortable. And at that moment Henry stopped what he was doing and looked at me with a serious expression I had never seen before. Then in a low and heavy voice he told me there were things about Richard's death he had never shared with me, and my heart started beating so fast that I thought it might burst out of my chest. Henry's words struck me so hard that I felt the air leave my lungs. I asked him what he meant about Richard's death, and he slowly sat down at the same kitchen table where our family had shared so many meals and where our boys had grown up. He rubbed his face as if trying to wipe away 25 years of pain before finally telling me the truth in a shaky voice. That night, he said, Damien was not in his room like he claimed, and Henry had seen him leave the house around 8 and decided to follow him because his behavior had been strange and full of anger for days. He told me he saw both boys near the gorge, arguing loudly, shouting terrible things at each other, and just hearing that made my head spin. When I asked what they were fighting about, Henry looked at me with tears in his eyes and said it was about money and the future because Richard, as the older brother, was expected to receive most of what we owned, and Damien was furious about that. Then he told me something even harder to accept, that a few days before his death, Richard had come to him and said he had found proof that Damien had been secretly taking money from our savings for a long time, first small amounts and then much more. I could hardly understand what I was hearing, because the son who had seemed so caring and helpful had been betraying us even before his brother was gone. I asked Henry why he had never told me any of this, and with a broken voice he said that when he reached the gorge that night, Richard was already gone, and Damien was standing there in shock, saying again and again that it was an accident. He told me Damien had begged him to help, claiming he only tried to protect himself and that Richard had lost his balance, and even now remembering it my tears wouldn't stop. I asked Henry if he really believed him and he nodded with a look of deep guilt, saying that Damien was still his son and that he couldn't undo one loss by losing the other, and that choice had stayed with him ever since. For a long time I truly believed it had all been a terrible accident and that Damien had learned his lesson and changed for the better. And when I asked Henry about the stolen money, he told me Damien had promised to return it little by little, saying he had used it for a business deal that failed. Henry said he chose to believe him because he couldn't accept the thought that his own son had done something unforgivable, and hearing that made my legs feel weak as I stood up and held onto the wall, realizing that everything I thought I knew about my family and the last 25 years of my life had been built on lies. I asked if Damien had ever paid the money back, and from Henry's face I already knew the answer, because he said he never did, and instead kept taking small amounts while Henry looked the other way, knowing that speaking up would mean admitting the truth he had been hiding for so long. He told me that by staying silent he had slowly become part of the problem, and in that moment I finally understood why Damien was now so eager to control our finances, not out of care, but because he wanted to protect himself and finish what he had started years ago. Then Henry told me there was something even more, something he had only discovered recently, and my heart sank as he brought out papers he had hidden away and explained that he had quietly looked into Damien's business and found it was close to collapse. The numbers showed that Damien owed more than $100,000 and was drowning in debt, and as I read them, my hands began to shake because our son was not the successful man he pretended to be, but someone living on borrowed time and borrowed money. When I asked if Melissa knew, Henry said he was sure she did because he had seen how carefully she guided every talk toward our savings, the house and our insurance, and in that moment her kind smiles no longer felt kind at all. They aren't innocent questions, Henry told me, they are the kind of questions someone asks when they are carefully counting how much our lives are worth, and hearing that made a cold fear run through my whole body. When I repeated the words about our lives in a quiet voice, it was the first time I truly understood that Damien might want to hurt us, not just trick us or take our money. Until then I had only thought about lies and cheating, but if he had already destroyed his own brother over money, what would stop him from doing the same to us? I grabbed Henry's hands and told him we had to go to the police and finally tell the truth about Richard and everything that was happening now. But he shook his head and said there was no proof and that he himself would be punished for hiding the truth for so many years, and no one would believe a man who had stayed silent for 25 years. He was right, and the thought made me feel trapped, but he said we had to be careful and find a way to protect ourselves and collect proof without raising suspicion. Before he could say more, the phone rang and it was Damien speaking in that warm, friendly voice that now sounded frightening to me, saying he and Melissa wanted to do something special for our 40th wedding anniversary and take us to the mountains for a family trip. As he talked about hiking and taking pictures together, my heart felt like it stopped, and I looked at Henry and saw the same fear in his eyes. I forced myself to answer politely and said we would think about it, but after the call ended, we both knew what that invitation really meant. I whispered that he was planning to take us there and make it look like an accident, and Henry silently agreed, and that night we didn't sleep at all, holding each other and trying to figure out how to stay alive. The days that followed felt like a terrible dream that I couldn't wake up from, because Henry and I had to pretend everything was normal whenever Damien and Melissa came over, smiling and agreeing with their cheerful talk about the mountain trip while fear was eating us alive inside. Every time I looked at them I felt sick, knowing what they had done in the past and what they were now planning to do to us. On Wednesday afternoon, Melissa arrived with a shopping bag and a bright smile that no longer looked kind to me, and she hugged me and said she had bought snacks, water, and fruit for our little trip, showing me everything with excitement, while all I could think about was how carefully she was preparing for something terrible. Then she proudly showed me her new camera, saying she wanted to capture every special moment of that day, and the way she said it made my stomach turn, because I could only imagine what kind of memories she truly wanted to keep. A moment later, Damien came in carrying a brand new hiking backpack and told Henry he had bought ropes, lights, and other equipment for a safe trip, and hearing him talk about safety while planning something so cruel made my head spin. I tried to sound calm and asked if it wasn't too risky for people our age, hoping to find any reason to cancel, but Melissa gently touched my face and said they had chosen a very easy path and that they would take care of us the whole time, and those words only made me more afraid. That evening, after they finally left, Henry and I sat in silence, shaking from fear and stress, and I told him we couldn't go and had to find an excuse, because the thought of that trip felt like walking straight into a trap. Henry said that if we refused to go, they would simply find another way to get rid of us, maybe something that looked like an accident at home, and that at least in the mountains we would know what they were planning to do. His words made sense in a frightening way, but they didn't make me feel any safer. When I asked him what we could possibly do, he thought for a while and then said we would go, but we would be ready, and that he would hide his phone and set it to record everything so that if we survived we would finally have proof, and if we didn't, at least the truth would not disappear with us. That Friday night, neither of us could really eat, because we both felt it might be our last evening in the house where we had lived so many happy years. Henry checked his papers one more time and made sure there was a clear record of our concerns, and then he showed me a sealed letter he had written to my sister Harriet, explaining everything about Richard and what we believed Damien was planning, and he had hidden it with our important documents so someone would know where to look if we never came back. We went to bed holding each other, whispering words of love, and Henry told me that no matter what happened, these 40 years with me had been the best of his life, and I lay there quietly trying to remember every small detail about him. Saturday morning arrived with a bright, clear sky that felt cruel in its beauty, and Damien came early, cheerful and relaxed, with Melissa right behind him, smiling as if it were a celebration instead of something terrible. During breakfast, which we could hardly touch, Damien spread a map on the table and explained the trail, talking about the view in the valley as if it were just another pleasant family outing, while I sat there knowing that this trip could be the end of everything. Damien's eyes were shining with a strange excitement that made my skin crawl, and when he talked about the beautiful views, all I could think was that they were meant to be the last things we would ever see. Melissa casually mentioned that some parts of the trail were steep but said it was nothing we couldn't handle, and hearing her talk about our so-called hiking experience felt like a cruel joke, because we were two people in our 60s who hardly ever walked more than a short stroll in the park. While we were getting ready to leave, I watched Damien carefully check his backpack and I noticed ropes, a small shovel and something that looked like a signal gun, and when I asked what it was for, he calmly said it was for safety in case something went wrong. In my mind, I could already see how they planned to use it after pushing us away so everything would look like a sad accident during a family trip. The drive to the mountains took about 2 hours, but it felt much longer, and Melissa played happy music and sang along as if nothing was wrong, while Damien drove slowly and carefully, following every rule, making sure nothing would ruin his plan. During the ride, Henry quietly took my hand and started the recording on his phone, and from that moment on, everything that happened was being saved, either as proof of our survival or as the last record of the truth. When we finally reached the start of the trail, my heart was beating so hard I could hardly breathe, and even though the place was peaceful and beautiful with tall trees and the sound of water nearby, to me it felt like the place where our lives might end. Damien and Melissa got out of the car, laughing and smiling as if it were a holiday, while I stood there trying to stay calm and strong. When Damien asked if we were ready for the adventure, I looked into his eyes, and for the first time in 25 years, I saw the same cold and frightening look he had the night his brother died. At first, the path was not too difficult, moving gently between tall trees and rocks covered in soft green moss. And Melissa walked ahead of us, stopping often to take pictures and talk excitedly about flowers and birds as if this were truly a happy family outing. She played her role perfectly, like a caring daughter-in-law enjoying a special day, while Damien stayed behind us, pretending to make sure we were all right, even though I could feel his stare on our backs the whole time. Every time I turned around, he gave me that practiced smile and asked if we needed to rest, and his false kindness made my stomach tighten. After about an hour, the trail became much steeper, my legs started to feel weak, and Henry was clearly struggling to breathe, and I knew they had planned it this way, choosing a path that would wear us down before doing what they came to do. When Melissa said we were almost at the lookout, I knew she was lying because I remembered the map and knew we still had a long way to go, which only confirmed that the place they had chosen for us was close. As we walked, I forced myself to remember every tree and every turn in the path, knowing I might need to describe it all later, and Henry was doing the same, and we shared quiet looks filled with fear and determination, because even though we knew we were walking into a trap, it was also our only chance to leave behind proof of the truth. When Melissa suddenly pointed to a tall rock formation and suggested we climb up there for some special photos, my heart nearly stopped because I knew at once that this was the place they had chosen. The cliff stood high above the main path and could only be reached by a narrow and much more dangerous side trail, with loose stones and very few trees to hold onto, and from the top you could see a deep drop into a rocky gorge. I tried to sound calm and said it didn't seem like a good idea for people our age, but Damien had already started walking toward it, using that familiar, convincing tone and saying it would only take a few minutes and that the pictures would be amazing. The way he said that word made me shake inside because I knew what he really meant. Henry gently squeezed my hand to remind me that everything was being recorded, and we both knew we had to keep going because turning back now would only delay what they were planning. The climb was slow and tiring, and the rocks slipped under our feet more than once, and with every step I realized how perfect this place was for something terrible, because a fall from up there would leave no chance to survive and no one would ever see it happen. Melissa reached the top first, moving easily as if she had practiced, and Damien followed her, then turned back to help us, and the way he held my arms felt cold and frightening. The view from the top was truly beautiful, with the valley, the distant mountains, and the river below, and in any other moment it would have been a memory to treasure, but that day it only made my fear even stronger. Knowing what I knew, that beautiful place felt more like the perfect stage for something terrible. When Melissa called us over and stood close to the edge, saying she wanted the valley in the background, Henry and I walked toward her slowly, and with every step my heart beat harder. I could see Damien moving behind us, carefully choosing his position like someone planning every detail in advance. Melissa lifted her camera and told us to hug and smile, and we held each other tightly, knowing it might be the last time, while she took picture after picture, each flash feeling like a warning. Then Damien stepped closer and suggested we move back a little so the view would look even better, and that one step put us right at the edge. Henry and I looked at each other and understood that this was the moment. When we stepped back, I felt there was nothing solid behind me anymore, only empty space. Melissa raised the camera again, but this time her eyes were different, cold and honest, and she told us to smile because this would be our last picture. Suddenly Damien rushed toward us, trying to push us over, but Henry reacted and grabbed his arm, pulling him forward and shouting that if we were going to fall, he would fall too. For a brief, terrifying moment, all four of us were struggling right there on the edge, tangled together, and then the ground slipped away and we all went down together, falling through the air toward the rocks below. And in that endless second, I thought of Richard and realized he must have felt this same fear when his brother betrayed him so many years ago. The fall hit us with a force I can hardly describe, and I heard terrible cracking sounds as my body slammed into the rocks, followed by a wave of pain so strong it almost made me lose my senses. My mouth filled with the taste of blood, and for a moment I was sure this was the end and that Damien had finally succeeded, leaving no one behind to tell the truth. Then through the noise in my head, I heard Henry's weak but steady voice telling me not to move and to pretend I was gone, and that was when I realized, almost unbelievably, that I was still alive. Every part of me hurt, my face was wet with blood and my clothes were soaked, but I forced myself to stay completely still, even slowing my breathing as much as I could. Not far away I could hear Damien and Melissa groaning, which told me they had survived too, and from their voices it sounded like they were in even worse shape. I heard my son ask his wife if she was okay, and when she said she thought her leg was broken and then coldly asked about the old people, I understood once again that we had never truly mattered to her. I heard Damien slowly moving closer, and my heart was beating so hard I was afraid he would notice. But after checking us he said we were gone and not breathing, and that lie gave me a small, fragile hope. Melissa sounded pleased and said everything had worked just like they planned except for the part where they also fell, and then she laughed and said at least they did not have to pretend anymore. For what felt like forever they talked about what to do next, agreeing to crawl until they could call for help and then tell a carefully prepared story about a tragic accident, repeating it to each other so it would sound the same, saying a rock had slipped, Henry had fallen, and I had been pulled with him, and that they were the poor, unlucky survivors of a terrible family disaster. Her act was so convincing that if I hadn't lived the truth myself, I might have believed every word. Slowly, their voices faded as they crawled toward what they hoped would be safety, leaving Henry and me alone in the wreckage. When silence finally settled, Henry whispered my name so softly I barely heard it. "Hilda, are you okay?" I answered in a whisper, letting him know I was alive though badly hurt. "My left leg is broken," he gasped, his voice thick with pain. "I think I have a few fractured ribs." "And you?" I did a quick mental check, feeling sharp pain in my right arm, a pounding headache and something wrong with my shoulder. But I was alive and that was more than I could have hoped for. "We're bad off but we're alive," I murmured. "It works but there's no signal down here." That was the cruelest part. Trapped at the bottom of a gorge, injured and unable to call for help, knowing that if no one came, we would die slowly from thirst, hunger or our wounds. "Henry," I whispered urgently, "before it's too late, tell me everything. Everything that really happened the night Richard died." He exhaled deeply as if he had waited 25 years to speak these words. His voice trembled as he began. Richard had come to him in the workshop, furious, clutching bank statements that proved Damien had been stealing from our accounts for months. Small amounts at first, then larger sums. Richard had been investigating discrepancies in our savings and wanted to confront Damien that very night. Henry tried to calm him, telling him to wait until the next day, but Richard refused, unable to sleep knowing his brother was stealing from us. I asked, though I already knew the answer, "And you followed him?" Henry nodded. "I followed him because I feared what might happen. I knew Richard's temper when he was angry, and I had noticed a coldness in Damien that had begun to worry me, a chill that made me uneasy." He continued, his voice breaking. "When I reached the gorge I found them screaming at each other. Richard had the papers in his hand, shaking them in Damien's face. 'You're a thief,' he shouted. 'You're stealing from our own parents.' Damien denied everything and said Richard was imagining things, and my heart started racing as I pictured my two sons standing in the dark, one accusing the other of a terrible betrayal. When I asked what happened next, Henry was quiet for a long time before he finally spoke and said Richard told Damien that if he didn't return the money and admit the truth, he would tell us himself. That was when Damien lost control, shouting that Richard had always been the favorite, that life had always been easier for him, and that it was time for things to change. And then Henry's voice broke as he confessed that Damien pushed Richard on purpose, not by mistake, and he saw Richard trying to keep his balance and reach for something, but it was already too late. Tears ran down my face, mixing with the blood from my injuries, and I asked why Henry had never told me the truth. He said that when he reached Damien, our son was crying and shaking, begging him to believe it was an accident and pleading not to be turned in because he couldn't bear to lose me too. And even though Henry knew deep down it wasn't true, he couldn't bring himself to give up his only remaining son. Then he admitted that Damien had promised to return the stolen money little by little, swore it would never happen again, but he never gave back a single cent and kept taking more while Henry stayed silent, becoming more and more involved in the lie. Just then we heard voices in the distance and realized Damien and Melissa had found help, and soon the rescue teams and helicopters were coming, bringing the most important moment of our lives. Henry whispered that his phone had recorded everything, including their plans and their own words, but if they found us alive too soon, they could destroy the proof before we could give it to the authorities. We both knew that if they realized we had survived and heard everything, they would try again in a more direct way, so we understood we had to stay quiet a little longer and wait for the exact right moment. Damien's voice suddenly echoed from above. shouting that his parents were down there and begging them to hurry, and his acting was so perfect, so full of pain and despair, that if I hadn't known the truth, I would have believed he was a son broken by grief. An authoritative voice, probably the leader of the rescue team, told him to stay calm and said they were coming down to check on everyone and that he and his wife could move, and soon I heard the sound of ropes, metal and equipment being prepared. Melissa played her part just as well, crying and saying she couldn't believe this had happened, repeating that we were happily taking pictures when a rock came loose and we fell, and every word felt like a knife in my heart because I knew she would tell that same story to the police and to anyone who would listen. The rescuers started to descend, their voices and boots getting closer, and Henry squeezed my hand to remind me we had to keep pretending no matter what. When they reached us, one of them said they had found 2 people at the bottom of the gorge and began checking us, and I kept my eyes closed and my breathing so shallow it barely existed while I felt him search for a pulse and listen for my breath. He said Henry still had a weak pulse, but that he wasn't sure about the woman and needed the medical team right away, and my heart was pounding because the plan was working. 4 long minutes that felt endless. The paramedics worked on us, put an oxygen mask on me, checked my injuries and strapped me to a stretcher, and every second I had to fight the urge to open my eyes and beg for help. Finally, I heard one of them report that the man was stable but critical and that the woman was in extremely bad condition with an almost unnoticeable pulse, and that we both had to be taken to the hospital immediately. Everything was going exactly as we had hoped. They were taking us to the hospital, and that meant we would finally have a chance to speak to the authorities without Damien and Melissa being able to stop us. As they lifted us up in the stretchers, I could hear Melissa's fake sobs and the rescuers comforting both of them, telling her how brave they were and what a miracle it was that they had survived, and I wanted to scream that the real miracle was that Henry and I were still alive to tell the truth. In the helicopter I could sense Henry lying next to me, and from the worried voices of the paramedics, I understood his condition was very serious, worse than mine, and for a terrifying moment I was afraid he might die before we could expose everything. One of the paramedics spoke gently to me, telling me to hold on because we were almost at the hospital, and that kindness felt so different from the cold lies of my own family. When we arrived, everything turned into chaos, with doctors and nurses rushing around, shouting orders I couldn't understand, and I was taken straight into an emergency room where they began treating my injuries. I kept pretending to be unconscious, but then I heard a nurse say my pulse was stronger than expected, and my heart nearly stopped because I thought they had discovered me, but the doctor only said that the body sometimes fights in strange ways after severe trauma and that they should keep watching me closely. I heard Melissa make a sound that was supposed to be crying but sounded more like relief, and then Damien asked if they could see us just for a moment to say goodbye in case it was the last chance. The doctor agreed, and soon I heard footsteps coming closer to my bed, knowing this was the most dangerous moment of all, because I had to convince my own son that I was truly dying. I felt Damien stand beside me and take my hand, and it took every bit of strength I had not to pull away and expose everything right there. He leaned close and whispered that he loved me and was sorry, but his words felt fake, sweet on the surface and cruel underneath. And when Melissa added that I had been like a mother to her and that they would never forget me, I knew the only reason they would remember me was because they believed they had finished what they started. Then Damien bent even closer and quietly said something that made my blood run cold, telling me I should never have asked questions about the money and that some things were better left buried, just like Richard, and in that moment I knew our plan was working because he had just revealed far more than he realized, and a nurse in the room had clearly heard it too. Even though I couldn't open my eyes, I could sense the nurse freeze in place, and through my lashes I saw her badge set ins and her face showed shock and fear because she understood exactly what those words meant. Melissa questioned him in a tense voice about mentioning Richard, and Damien quickly tried to backtrack, saying it didn't matter anymore, but it was obvious they both knew he had made a serious mistake, and she hurried him out, saying the doctors needed space. After they left, the nurse came close and whispered that she knew I could hear her and that what she had just heard was not normal, and if I was in danger I needed to tell her somehow. With all the strength I had, I slowly moved my finger once, then again, and her eyes widened as she realized I was pretending to be unconscious. She told me to move my finger 3 times if those people had hurt us, and I did exactly that without hesitation. She looked shaken but determined, stepped away to pretend to check my 4, and I could see she was trying to decide what to do next, and when she came back I knew for the first time since the mountain that we might finally have a real chance to survive and tell the truth. She whispered that she was going to speak to the doctor in charge, but that I had to keep pretending until they could protect me, and I answered by moving my finger once. The minutes that followed felt endless as I lay there alone, praying she would believe me and do the right thing. At last I heard footsteps and Inns returned, this time with an older man who was clearly the head doctor, and to my surprise 2 police officers. The doctor spoke softly and told me that Nurse Inns had explained everything and that I was safe now, that the officers were there to protect me, and the relief I felt almost made me break my act. One of the officers asked me to open my eyes and I did it slowly, letting the bright hospital light fade until I could see their worried faces, and I heard Inns say she was glad she hadn't imagined it all. The officer introduced himself as Detective Johnson and said they knew I was in serious danger and needed to hear what really happened on the mountain, and with a dry, shaky voice I told him that my son and his wife had pushed us. What followed was a blur of questions, statements, and long explanations, and I told him everything about Richard, about the stolen money, about the pressure to change our will, and about the plan to kill us. Then I explained that Henry had recorded everything on his phone, and when the detective heard that, he went straight to my husband's room. Henry had woken up by then, and without hesitation he gave them his phone and said it held years of lies and the truth about that day. While the police worked on the recording, Damien and Melissa sat in the waiting area pretending to be heartbroken, completely unaware that their careful act was finally coming to an end. An hour later, the detective came back with a grave but satisfied look and told us the recording was crystal clear, that it contained direct confessions about Richard's murder, admissions of stealing money, and undeniable proof that Damien and Melissa had planned to kill us, which was more than enough to have them arrested. I asked in fear if they would be taken in right there at the hospital, worried about what might happen if they realized we were alive and talking, and he assured me they already had officers in position and would move the moment the warrants were signed, and that until then we were under full police protection. The bitter irony hit me hard because downstairs they were probably accepting condolences, acting like grieving relatives, maybe even discussing our funeral and inheritance, while upstairs we were quietly destroying their world of lies. Then the detective added something else that made my blood run cold. After checking Damien's finances, they had discovered he wasn't just bankrupt, he also owed large sums to dangerous, illegal lenders who don't forgive or forget, which meant our inheritance wasn't just convenient for him, it was his only way out, and without it he might not have survived much longer. For him our deaths weren't just useful, they were necessary. When I asked about our grandchildren, my heart breaking at the thought of their future, he said social services would take them for now, but that we could apply for custody once we recovered, and the idea felt heavy but also like the only way to turn some small piece of this horror into something good. Finally, an officer came in with the signed papers, the detective said it was time, and through my window I could see police quietly taking their positions in the parking lot, and I knew that after 25 years, the moment of truth had finally arrived. The officer's firm voice echoed through the hall as he announced that Damien Black and Melissa Black were under arrest for the murder of Richard Black and for trying to kill Henry and me. And for a few seconds the silence was so heavy it felt unreal, until Melissa began shouting that it was all a mistake and that we had died in an accident, only for the officer to calmly explain that we were alive and had given full proof of what they had done. Damien then panicked and yelled that it was impossible because he had seen us die. A statement that only made things worse for him because it sounded like a clear confession, and almost immediately both of them started blaming each other, shouting that the other one had planned everything, breaking apart their partnership in a matter of minutes. About an hour later, Detective Johnson came to my room and told me they were both on their way to the station and that their mutual accusations were only helping the case, but then he revealed something else that made my blood run cold. During the arrest, the police found a small recorder in Damien's backpack, and it turned out he had been secretly recording our conversations for weeks because he knew we were starting to suspect something. That meant the mountain trip was not sudden or innocent at all, it was planned as a direct response to our doubts, and in one of those recordings Melissa could even be heard saying they had to act fast before we went to the police, which showed just how cold and calculated they had been. They hadn't only planned to kill us, they had been watching us, listening to us, and deciding when the time was right, and as the detective said this, I realized we had been living under the same roof as people who were quietly preparing our end. Then he looked at me seriously and added that there was still something else they had discovered while digging deeper into Damien's finances. The detective then told me that my son not only owed money to dangerous lenders, but had also been forging my signature on several papers to try to get into our bank accounts, and if Henry and I had died on that mountain he would have been able to take everything right away, which felt like another deep wound because it meant he hadn't just planned to kill us, he had already been stealing from us and breaking every bit of trust we had ever given him. When I asked how much money he had taken, even though part of me didn't want to hear the answer, the detective said it was around $50,000 over the last 5 years, taken little by little so we wouldn't notice. But when added together it was a huge amount, money that Henry and I had saved slowly over a lifetime of hard work while our own son used it to support his life and prepare our end. The days that followed in the hospital passed in a blur of police questions, meetings with lawyers and non-stop calls from journalists who had already named the case the worst family betrayal of the decade, and soon reporters from everywhere wanted to hear our story. My sister Harriet came as fast as she could, crying and holding me, telling me she had always felt something was wrong with Damien after Richard died but never imagined it could be this bad, and her words, strangely, brought me a little comfort because they showed I hadn't been completely blind. When I asked about my grandchildren who were now with social services, she said she had seen them and that they were confused and kept asking why their parents couldn't come home, too young to understand the truth. Our lawyer, Albert, the same man who had prepared our will, visited us and said the case was very strong because of the recordings, the things Damien and Melissa said during the arrest and all the financial proof, and that it would be very hard for them to avoid serious punishment. But then he added something that made my blood run cold again. They were trying to get a lighter sentence by saying it was a crime of passion and not something planned, and I couldn't hold back my anger because this wasn't a sudden mistake at all. They had prepared for weeks, bought equipment and chosen the place carefully, and nothing about it was an accident. Albert listened to me and nodded seriously, saying he understood, and that while we did have strong proof that everything was planned in advance, their lawyers would still try to claim it was a desperate act caused by heavy financial stress, as if that could somehow excuse what they had done. The thought that they might get lighter sentences made my blood boil because they hadn't just made one mistake, they had killed Richard, tried to kill us and stolen from us for years, and now they wanted to look like victims of bad luck. I asked Albert what we could do to make sure justice was really served, and he answered simply that we had to testify because our words, together with all the evidence, would help the jury see the truth, even though he warned me it would be emotionally painful to face my own son in court and hear his lawyers try to defend the indefensible. He was right, the idea of looking Damien in the eyes and reliving all of it in public terrified me, but I knew I had to do it for Richard, for ourselves, and for my grandchildren who deserved to know who their parents really are. 3 weeks after the arrest, Henry and I were finally allowed to go back home, still hurt but able to move, with him on crutches and my arm in a sling, and the house felt empty and strange, like a place frozen in time, with the breakfast dishes still in the sink, the bed unmade, and the flowers Damien had brought now dried and lifeless on the table, as if our old life had ended that very day and never continued. That first night, lying in our own bed again, I asked Henry if he thought we could ever be happy, and he held me close and said he didn't know, but we were alive, the truth was finally out, and for the first time in 25 years, we didn't have to live with secrets anymore. 6 months later, the trial finally began. A life filled with integrity and love, the life that should have been theirs to see. I share stories about his laughter, his curiosity, and the joy he brought to our family before Damien took him away. It's my way of keeping Richard alive for them, of letting them know that goodness and honesty matter, and that even in the face of betrayal and darkness, family can still be a source of love and safety. Henry and I have rebuilt our home into a place of warmth, laughter, and trust, and every smile on the children's faces reminds me that hope and healing are possible, even after the deepest wounds. Each day we watch them grow, slowly filling the emptiness left by loss with love, teaching them the life lessons Richard would have shared, and making sure that the cycle of manipulation and cruelty ends with us.